Hi, the subject of this video is campaign finance. First, a little bit of history. The Federal Corrupt Practices Act of 1925 was the first federal-level attempt to regulate campaign finances. It came on the heels of the Teapot Dome scandal, which occurred during the Harding administration. Then we had the Political Activities Act, aka the Hatch Act of 1939. It banned partisan political activities by all federal government employees except the Vice President, the President, and Senate-confirmed political appointees. The Hatch Act also limited the amount of money a group could spend on an election by placing a $5,000 cap on contributions from an individual or group. Groups got around this limitation by breaking themselves into smaller groups. Now, does money equal free speech? Federal courts seem to think so. Here I want to mention 4 federal court cases, 3 of them decided by the Supreme Court and 1 decided by the Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. First is Buckley v. Valeo. This is a Supreme Court case from 1976. The court held that a candidate can spend as much of their own money as they want on their own campaign because of the First Amendment's protection of freedom of speech. Next, we have Citizens United v. Federal Election Commission. Decided by the Supreme Court in 2010, this case held that independent expenditures cannot be limited as long as they are not coordinated with the candidate and/or his political campaign, and the money does not go directly to the candidate and/or his political campaign, but is rather spent independently by the group. Next, we have SpeechNow.org versus Federal Election Commission, also decided in 2010, right on the heels of Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. This case held that contributions to super PACs cannot be limited. The court held that government cannot restrict independent expenditures for political campaigns by corporations, including nonprofit corporations, labor unions, and other associations. The difference between Citizens United versus FEC and SpeechNow.org versus FEC is that Citizens United upheld the constitutionality of unlimited expenditures, unlimited independent expenditures. The point of SpeechNow.org said that it's unconstitutional to limit how much a group that engages in independent expenditures receives. So these are 2 different ends of political spending. Citizens United is all about unlimited spending, as long as it is independently done. And SpeechNow.org is all about unlimited contributions to groups that spend independently. And in combination, these 2 cases is what led to the creation of super PACs. Finally, we have McCutcheon versus Federal Election Commission. The Supreme Court case decided in 2014. It allowed individuals to contribute to an unlimited number of candidates and PACs, and while limits per candidate per election exist and are constitutional, an aggregate limit is unconstitutional. In other words, if you're an individual and you're contributing to a political campaign, you are limited to, as of 2022, to $2,900 per candidate. But there is no limit in the aggregate. So there is no limit to how many different candidates you can contribute. So what's been happening recently with regard to campaign spending? What kind of trends do we see? Well, we see, not surprisingly, an upward trend in spending. Elections continue to become more expensive. In 2022, the combined spending on congressional races by federal candidates and political committees was more than $8.9 billion. That's a new record, swamping the $7.1 billion spent 4 years earlier, and even higher than the $8.7 billion spent in the 2020 presidential election. once elected to office, we see that members of Congress find it much easier to raise funds and are thus able to outspend their challengers. Incumbents outrace their opponents by a significant amount because most donations come from businesses, interest groups, and political actions committees go to incumbents. These donors seek a voice in government for their investment, right, for their donations. Thus, they want to invest in the candidate who is most likely to win. And incumbents win most of the time. We also see that candidates with the most campaign dollars often, but not always, win. Barack Obama and Joe Biden raised more than their opponents, and both won. In 2016, however, Hillary Clinton spent more than her opponent, Donald Trump. She did not win. In 2020, we see that a new record was set for a U.S. Senate campaign. Democrat Jamie Harrison spent $160 million on his campaign for the Senate in South Carolina and still lost by a huge margin to Lindsey Graham. What are the sources of campaign funds? There are at least 7 possible sources. 1. Individual donors. 2. PACs or political action committees. 3. 527 committees. 4. Super PACs. 5. Dark money groups, aka 501c4 committees. 6. Public funding. And 7. Candidates' own funds. First, individual donors. An individual donor can give $2,900 per candidate per election, $5,000 per federal PAC per calendar year, and $35,000 per national party committee per calendar year, and $10,000 to state and local committees per calendar year. So there are obviously limitations on how much an individual can contribute to a single candidate or a single category of spending. But again, as per McCutcheon versus Federal Election Commission, individuals are allowed to give to as many sources as they want. If it's their own money, they may be limited to how much they can give to a single candidate or a single category of organization, like to a single PAC. There's no limit to how much they can give in total to multiple recipients. Number 2 is PAC, or political action committees. PACs are organizations established by corporations, labor unions, or interest groups to channel money into political campaigns. As of 2022, limits and rules are as follows: $5,000 to a candidate per election, primary and general, $15,000 to a political party per year, $5,000 to another PAC per year. The Federal Election Campaign Act of 1971 is the basis of all modern campaign finance regulations. And this act has been amended at least 4 different times in 1974, 1976, 1979, and 2002. The law requires full disclosure of federal campaign contributions. 3 is 527 committees. A 527 committee is a group established for the purposes of political advocacy and required to report its source of funding to the IRS. Contributions are unlimited except for PACs. All political committees, including state, local, and federal candidate committees, traditional political action committees, super PACs, and political parties, are considered 527 groups. Okay, so 527 designation is an umbrella designation for various groups. Again, these groups are political committees, including at the state, local, and federal levels, candidate committees, traditional political action committees, super PACs. All of them are 527s. The money can be used to buy campaign ads, to send mail, or otherwise advocate for the election or defeat of specific candidates. Super PACs. Super PACs, aka Independent Expenditures Only Committees, they're a type of PAC. Okay, so they're a variation of a PAC, but they're a special variation. They cannot donate money directly to candidates or coordinate their expenditures with those of a candidate's campaign. However, super PACs can raise and spend unlimited sums of money to advocate for or against a political candidate, including paying for campaign ads. Super PACs are required to disclose their donors to the Federal Election Commission. After Buckley versus Valeo struck down limits on independent expenditures and Citizens United versus FEC allowed 527 committees to raise unlimited funds, and then later the same year SpeechNow.org versus Federal Election Committee allowed unlimited contributions, super PACs came into existence. Number 5 is dark money groups, aka 501c4 committees. 501c4 committees are a nonprofit social welfare group that also engages in political advocacy but may not spend more than half of its revenue for political purposes. 501c4 can spend unlimited amounts on political campaigns and not disclose their donors as long as their activities are not coordinated with the candidate's campaign and political activities are not the primary purpose of the group. 501c4 campaign ads must omit the so-called magic words, most of which are actually phrases rather than words. And what are those magic words? Vote for, elect, cast your ballot for, and reject. These words and phrases were defined in Buckley versus Valeo. A common practice for wealthy and corporate donors, as well as for foreigners, is to route campaign contributions through a 501c4 to avoid the legal limits on contributions. Examples of 501c4 groups: the National Rifle Association, the National Organization for Women, the American Civil Liberties Union. So these are so-called social welfare groups. Their primary purpose is supposed to be to advocate for social welfare, that is to say, for the improvement of some aspect of society. 6. Public funding. Candidates running in the major party presidential primaries are eligible for public funds by raising at least $5,000 in individual contributions of $250 or less. Candidates who reach this threshold may apply for federal funds to match on a dollar-for-dollar basis all contributions of $250 or less. By accepting matching funds, candidates agree to spend no more than $48 million in their presidential primary campaigns, including their personal funds and funds from private donors. So once you accept public funds, you are bound by legally enforceable limits on how much you can spend. And as of 2022, that limit was $48 million approximately in the presidential primary campaign. Buckley versus Valeo in 1976 struck down as violating free speech limits on campaign spending unless the candidate accepts public financing. So accepting of public financing comes with very serious limitations on how much a candidate can spend. 7th and last is candidates one's own funding. Candidates can spend, again as per Buckley versus Valeo, their own money on their own campaigns without any limit. So money talks. We have seen that throughout the decades, the Supreme Court has been friendly to campaign contributions. And there's currently at least one justice in the Supreme Court, and that's Clarence Thomas, who maintains that all limits on campaign contributions are illegal because they violate the free speech clause of the First Amendment. Other justices take a more modest approach. The majority on the Supreme Court supports extensive role of money in politics. And we saw that, starting with Buckley versus Valeo in 1976 and then escalating in 2010 with a pair of Supreme Court decisions. The role of money has risen, and there's no end in sight because political campaigns are increasing in cost. So Citizens United versus FEC and SpeechNow.org versus FEC launched a new era of more money being spent. And even though we keep saying that the role of television in the American society may be declining, we're talking about narrowcasting, we're talking about more targeted appeal. The overall cost of campaigns has taken off in the 21st century like a rocket ship and keeps just going up and up, which is why I would suggest that in the coming years and decades, political campaigns will remain very costly, and candidates who are skilled in raising money will be at a serious advantage. And we know that incumbency, just incumbency alone, gives a significant advantage in raising money. So the story continues. The power of incumbency draws money to itself, and money assures re-election. So there's a vicious circle in which it is very difficult to get of incumbents because donors want those people they can rely on years into the future. They see money they spend on political campaigns as investment in their own interests. So they keep giving to incumbents because they know that incumbents win. And incumbents win because they get the lion's share of the money. Thank you.